All right, so it is my pleasure to introduce our next speaker. Dr. Catherine W. Zipf is the Executive Director of the Bristol Historical and Preservation Society in Bristol, Rhode Island, and she studies the underdogs and the elites when they were underdogs of American architectural history. With an interest in race and gender, she reconstructs lost or overlooked histories, providing a new and often surprising viewpoint on the traditional narrative. So please join me in welcoming Catherine Zipf.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. This is since it seems to be what we're doing, my fourth trip to Nantucket, and I have to say that I am the proud owner of a Gut Fish Not Houses bumper sticker, which I understand are becoming elusive, so I could entertain an offer. I'm getting older. All right. So I'm here today to talk to you about the Green Book and sites listed in the Green Book. And you can ask me later how I got involved in this project. It is a story, and it does explain about 5 years ago that really large sucking sound you heard coming from Rhode Island. That was me getting very sucked into this project. But it is a wonderful project, and I have enjoyed every last little bit of it. So today I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Green Book history and about the sites listed in the Green Book in Rhode Island, and then we're going to have a quick look at Nantucket's only Green Book site. So to begin, for much of the 20th century, African Americans were on the move. Beginning as early as the 1890s, Jim Crow-era discrimination and racism led them to seek out new opportunities. They found them in northern cities like New York, Baltimore, Chicago, and Detroit, where industries founded during and after the Second World Wars, both World Wars, but particularly after World War II, were thriving. Fueling this movement was improved access to automobiles, which freed African Americans from travel restrictions and from the discriminatory policies of buses and trains. However, there was no guarantee that any city would prove hospitable to a stranger or that there would be safe places to stay along the way. The need for a travel guide catering specifically to African Americans was identified as early as 1930. The guides borrowed their format from business directories published in cities around the country, beginning in the mid-19th century. The goal was that these guides be easy to use for those in unfamiliar territory. Now, the travel guides coordinated with other efforts within the African American community. One example of these efforts was the National Negro Business League, founded by Booker T. Washington and incorporated in New York in 1901. Washington intended the League to help African Americans by creating a network of affiliated interests open to any African American within their community. Washington's goal was to attack the problem of racial discrimination through economic development, and to that end, the NNBL, the Business League, grew quickly, eventually reaching a height of 320 chapters across the country. Associated networks included the National Negro Bankers Association, the National Negro Press Association, the National Negro Association of Funeral Directors, the Bar Association, insurance, retail, real estate, and finance. So annual meetings of organizations like the National Negro Business League made it easier to compile listings of travel-oriented businesses friendly to African American tourists around the country. At the same time, there were challenges to gathering such information. African American businesses often changed locations and owners. Travel-oriented businesses, particularly tourist homes, a tourist home is like a modern-day B&B. That was what they called it in the 1930s. So tourist homes in particular could be especially difficult to keep track of. And in a pre-computer era, keeping records of who was where was both daunting and challenging. Errors happened with a high level of frequency, and you'll see that today in the sites that I'm going to present to you a little bit later on. Now, on their surface, the purpose of travel guides appeared to be to enable African Americans to move safely through the landscape while on vacation. And I say appeared to be, they did do that, but they did a few other things. There were several other purposes. Many business directories encouraged African Americans to support local businesses and not to shop where they could not work. Scholar Cotton Seller describes the purpose of guidebooks as, quote, communal racial uplift. And he quotes Claude Barrett, the founder of the Association of the Negro Press, as saying that, quote, African Americans should only buy from their own firms or at least companies that hired Black employees, unquote. Travel guides also allowed African Americans to escape Jim Crow era violence permanently and to move their families safely through the landscape. And they served to record African American businesses, particularly those owned by women, for the present day. So overall, these guides are about movement through space, but they're really about far more than that. Now, while the Green Book was the most famous travel guide, today it is particularly well known, it was not the only one. The first one was the Hackley and Harrison's Hotel and Apartment Guide for Colored Travelers, founded in 1930-31 and published by Sarah D. Harrison and her partner Edwin Henry Hackley, a lawyer and journalist. Harrison was a member of the Negro Welfare Council of New London, Connecticut, and had identified the need for a travel guide as part of her job. The guide itself tells how Harrison had received a letter from W.E.B. Du Bois asking if she knew of safe accommodations in New London. As Harrison wrote, quote, "Mr. Du Bois was writing unknowingly to the originator of the guide idea. His query aptly illustrates the practicality and universal need of the public service hereby supplied." This is from the guide itself. "Now the guide tells you who, capital, and where, capital. You have only to write for reservations," unquote. So Harrison compiled the information with the help of correspondents in over 300 cities to whom she was connected through the Negro Welfare Council network. The Hackley and Harrison guide set the tone for subsequent guides in that it listed specific places that would regularly accommodate a traveler unfamiliar with the city. Other guides rapidly followed, including the U.S. Travel Bureau Directory of Negro Hotels and Guest Houses, which was printed 1939-41, the Afro-American Newspaper's Travel Guide to Negro Hotels and Guest Houses, 1942, the Travel Guide, 1947 to 1955, Grayson's Travel and Business Guide, circa 1949. We've actually only located one copy of Grayson's Travel Guide. If you know of any others, please tell me. There was the Go Guide to Pleasant Motoring, 1952 to 1965, and of course, the Negro Motorist Green Book, 1937 to 1967. So the Green Book was the most famous of these guides, and it was the longest lasting. It was officially the Negro Motorist Green Book or the Negro Traveler's Green Book. Today we know it a little more colloquially as the Green Book. When Victor Green began publishing the Green Book in 1937, segregation had been a fact of life for almost 40 years. Green was a 44-year-old mail carrier in New York City, and so he was pretty well positioned to know where African Americans could go and where they couldn't. The first year's guide covered New York City and listed gas stations and hotels, as well as tourist homes in the New York City area. Green compiled these listings from his own experience and from those of his fellow mail carriers. The Green Book rapidly took off. By 1938, Green had expanded his listings beyond New York City to include cities and towns in 21 states and Washington, D.C. There were also listings for summer resorts at the end of the guide. The Green Book was sold in Black churches and through the Negro Urban League, but the support given it by the SO, or Standard Oil, for those who do not know, SO, S-O, Standard Oil, okay? So SO's support was particularly key. SO gas stations were one of the few that served African Americans, and they carried the Green Book in their stations as early as 1940. The 1949 edition of the Green Book even included an endorsement from SO. And this is what they look like on the inside. I think you see the covers pretty often, but this is the interior pages. So within 10 years, the directory had expanded to include 46 states, and it had reached its height of a 20,000 issue print run. The published guide was quite small, about 6 inches by 4 inches, so it's sort of about yay big, and therefore it fits pretty easily into the glove box. Over time, as the guide expanded, readers joined postal carriers in submitting listings, making it one of the first African-American travel guides to incorporate user-generated content. That's a very 21st century idea, but the Green Book had it first. And although the actual pages were modest and the listings are Spartan, this is honestly not much to look at on the inside, inclusion in the Green Book was often considered an honor. Now, Green was an idealistic and hopeful man, and he wrote in the 1948 volume, quote, "There will be a day sometime in the near future when this guide will not have to be published. That is when we as a race will have equal opportunities and privileges in the United States." And this quote is often Again, this is a very common quote attributed to Victor Green, which is not to say that he did not say it. But I think that he was very, very optimistic, as we will see in the end with what happens. So Green retired in 1952 to publish the Green Book full-time. And while he lived comfortably, he never made millions, preferring to keep the Green Book's prices low. Originally, the Green Book cost 25 cents. Over time, the cost of it reached only $1 throughout its run. That's in comparison to some of the other guides. Grayson's cost 5. The final editions contained about 100 pages of listings that covered the entire United States and abroad. So what happened? The Green Book's demise is often described as being caused by the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which rendered its concept obsolete in theory. And I've heard that. People have said the Civil Rights Act passed and we tossed out our Green Books. I want to be a little more critical of that. In fact, Victor Green had died in 1960, leaving the guide without its driving visionary, and you can see that things are starting to get a little shaky even as early as 62. The increase in civil rights activities during the early 1960s raised question as to whether publications like the Green Book undermined the push for full equality. This is well covered in the recent Pulitzer Prize-winning book Franchise, this whole idea of this approach is not working. Sales began to erode after the 1960s, and the Green Book came to a close in 1966-67, bringing a key era in African-American travel history to a close. All right, so let's turn our attention to Rhode Island. As the smallest state in the nation, it is not surprising to find that Rhode Island had relatively few Green Book listings, a total of 24 for the publication's entire run. There they all are. In comparisons to other states, this is very small. North Carolina, for example, has 330, Maryland and Mississippi hover at 250, New Jersey, 690, New York City is 700, and the rest of New York State is easily another 650. So Rhode Island, teeny. Also different is that Rhode Island's sites cluster in the state's two major cities, Providence and Newport, with a very minor exception of one site listed for 1 year out in Westerly. Newport had 8 sites, while Providence had 15. In other states, like Arkansas, and as we'll see, Massachusetts, there is a far greater geographic spread. At the same time, the sites are often tied to highways, as is the case in Maryland, or travel patterns like the Jazz Circuit in Mississippi. So in Rhode Island, on the one hand, the state's small size and its proximity to other cities like Boston and Hartford, the number of sites is not surprising. You can drive through Rhode Island the long way in 45 minutes. But on the other side of this, in light of the state's long participation in the slave trade, the few number of sites is surprising. Just to remind everybody, Rhode Island is a triangle on the triangle trade. One would expect Rhode Island to be home to a relatively large population of African Americans since its early days. But according to the US Census, Newport's African American population never reached more than 8.5% of the population, and Providence's was never higher than 15%. Despite these figures, Rhode Island's African American population was increasing between 1930 and 1960, or precisely the years that the Green Book was in operation. In Providence, the African American population rose from 2.2% to 8.9% from 1930 to 1970, and Newport's rose from 5.6% to 7.3%. So really, Rhode Island is very white, but the population is increasing. Now, Rhode Island was not without its 20th century racial strife. The KKK was active in rural parts of the state, and the Watchman Institute, a school for African American children, founded to follow the educational theories of Booker T. Washington, was targeted several times in the 1920s and 1930s. It's usually shocking for people to hear that the KKK was in Rhode Island. It was. Throughout the 20th century, racial tensions between the state's African Americans and other ethnic groups could run high. But in general, the state's prosperity during the 20th century helped it avoid any major issues. All right, so Rhode Island's Green Book sites, here they all are, have a high rate of survival. About half are still standing, 4 out of 8 in Newport and 7 out of 15 in Providence. Relative to other states, this is remarkable. For example, the survival rate in North Carolina is 11%. Also, relative to other areas, there is no single factor accounting for those that have been lost. In Newport, for example, the 4 houses were replaced with new construction, a new police department, a park, and a public housing development. The sites lost in Providence have similar explanations. In contrast, most of Baltimore's Green Book sites were wiped out by I-95. So in many senses, Rhode Island is the exception, but not the norm. However, this exceptional embarrassment of riches permits a different kind of research, one that allows for a deep dive into the history of each site. So because I have only 24 sites, I can really look at each one of them, and I have, which has been really fun. That's the fun part. So the small number of Rhode Island sites means that it's possible to research them very deeply as a group, something that's not really possible or is much, much harder in the other states. Research from census data, city directories, deeds, and other public sources have highlighted how ephemeral and changing the Green Book sites often were. So this recaptured history also yields insight into what it might have been like for those running the sites and for those using their services. So 20th century Providence and Newport bustled with all kinds of commercial and industrial activity. The state had strong foundations in textile manufacture and banking from its early days as an 18th century center for shipping. These activities reached a height between 1890 and 1920, creating significant demand for immigrant and African American labor. By 1920, just as the Biltmore Hotel was constructed, and we're going to look at the Biltmore Hotel in a minute because that's a Green Book site, so just as it was constructed, Providence was one of the most ethnically diverse cities in the country. So ditto for Newport, as new industries developed to keep the economy moving. In the early years of the century, the U.S. Navy stepped up its presence in Newport and constructed a new base in the northern part of the city. Following this action, several military-related industries were established in the city, the major part of which revolved around torpedo manufacturing. Then, during the 1950s, the naval station was expanded to accommodate the cruiser-destroyer force ships and made Newport its headquarters for those ships in 1962. All of this activity created a significant number of working class and manufacturing jobs that appealed to African American laborers. So that's what our Green Book listings are about. They're about this changing economy in Rhode Island. So these activities made Providence and Newport both a travel and work destination for African Americans, and Providence's Green Book listings reflect that diversity in particular. Of the 15 sites listed, there are 3 hotels, 5 tourist homes, 4 beauty parlors, a restaurant, a tavern, and an automotive service station. Several of the sites cluster around the intersection of Benefit and North Main Street. That's where the lower cluster of dots on the right is. The really thick cluster looks like 3. Listings in this part of town include Dinah's Tourist Home, the Hines Tourist Home, and Lucille's Beauty Parlor, all in a single block of North Main Street. Marie Wells Beauty Parlor and the W.W. Joyce Tourist Home on Benefit Street, and the Retlaw Tourist Home and B. Boyd's Beauty Parlor on nearby Camp Street. The 2 dots on the upper right there, that's B. Boyd's and Retlaw. Another cluster is located to the south in the sort of lower left part of it. And all of these suggest that Providence's African American community was really far more spread out around the city, far more diverse, and I think far more active than many people think. All right, so we're going to look at some sites. If you've been to Newport, I assure you, you have not looked at this building. It's not the building that people go to. And I fight that a lot in Newport because everybody thinks, oh, we should take these buildings and we should open them to the public and let's interpret them. And then you gently point out that no, people come here to Newport for the breakers and not for this. In fact, I was really stunned at how, just really frankly, that it survived intact. So this is the Glover Hotel, located at 26 Brindley Street in Newport. It was listed 1938 to 1940 in the Green Book. If you know Newport, this is behind the Jewish cemetery back in the corner of K Street and Bellevue Avenue. So the Glover Hotel was run by a man named Thomas Glover. The house is a massive, it is big, 3-story structure, quite nondescript in its appearance. Its windows are regularly placed but asymmetrical. It is shingled with plain trim. Glover purchased 26 Brindley Street in 1909. At the time, he was working as a manager at 4 Washington Square. I don't know what at 4 Washington Square he managed. The site was later cleared during the construction of Long Wharf Mall, so I don't really have any clues. Glover himself resided at 10 Hall Avenue amid a small African-American neighborhood. That's off Broadway, again, if you're following Newport. And so I believe that during this early period, Glover was renting out 26 Brindley Street to tenants. So this changes in 1913 when Glover took out a mortgage on 26 Brindley Street from the Industrial Trust Company, or the Superman building, and opened 26 Brindley Street as a lodging house, even though he himself continued to reside on Hall Avenue. 10 years later, in 1923, things really dramatically changed. Glover got married, and his wife, Susan, and he moved on to the hotel property. Together, the two of them ran the hotel very successfully, as Glover listed no other occupation in the directory. Now, Susan died November 26, 1931, and after her death, things began to fall apart. Only months later, Glover had moved out of the hotel to 9 Fillmore Avenue, where he resided for the remainder of his time in Newport. The directories report no further occupation for him between 1931 and 1938, the last time his name appears. He may have retired, or he may have been too deeply affected by his wife's death to continue, or he may have been affected by Depression-era economics, or any combination. In 1938, Glover made a last-ditch effort to recover his business, listing the property in the Green Book as the Glover Hotel for just that year. However, it seems to have been too late. On January 30th, 1939, the Industrial Trust Company foreclosed on his 1913 mortgage for breach of payment. A few weeks later, the Industrial Trust sold the property to Curtis and Ethel Ames, who had already been living there. Now, the Ames were also an African-American family. Curtis was born in 1895 in Virginia, and Ethel was born in 1897 in Maryland, so they're part of the Great Migration. They had 3 children, Theron, Fred, and Edmund, all born in Rhode Island. Now, the Ames may have intended to continue to operate 26 Brindley as a hotel, as they maintained the Green Book listing for 2 more years until 1940, when they discontinued it. That year, Curtis went to work at the Newport torpedo factory, which was probably a much better source of income than running a Green Book site. He retired around 1958, having by then rented 26 Brindley, it's a big house, to several people in Newport, including several people from the US Navy. In 1969, here's the last key part of this story, Ames sold the property to Doris Duke, and it remains today in the hands of the Newport Restoration Foundation. All right. So this is the Mrs. L. Jackson Tourist Home at 35 Bath Road, or again, if you know Newport, that's Memorial Boulevard. The Mrs. L. Jackson Tourist Home at 35 Bath Road was listed in the Green Book from 1939 to 1956. It's the second longest listing in Newport. The occupants of the house during this period were Sophie Burney, Amanda Torrance, and Adele Henderson, all African-American widows. They were born in, Burney was born in Virginia, Torrance was born in Virginia in 1863, so she was probably born to an enslaved mother. And Henderson was born in Maryland in 1889. I don't know how they met each other. By 1940, Torrance had retired, and Burney and Henderson were working in private homes elsewhere in Newport. In 1939, they began listing in the Green Book, something that seems to have worked out for them since they continued the listing for another couple of decades. They rented the property from a Carolyn Ann Marshall, who owned it as part of a trust given to her from her father. All right, so then things begin to happen. In 1945, Marshall sold the property to Burney. 1 month later, Burney turned and sold it herself to the Hope Circle King's Daughters and Sons, Inc., which I believe, it's been difficult to find out what they are, but I believe they are a non-denominational Christian service organization associated with Chautauqua. They held the property, that organization, until 1976, exactly 20 years after the last Green Book listing. So interestingly, there is no record of an L. Jackson associated with the site. There is no L. Jackson who owned the property. There is no L. Jackson who lived on Bath Road. And Burney was listed in the Newport directories every year that the site was listed at this address. So who is L. Jackson? I think that, the answer is I don't know who L. Jackson is, but I think it raises the really significant question of how the Green Book solicited and maintained its listings. So in 1947, Bath Road underwent what is best described as urban renewal, changing its name to Memorial Boulevard. But the Green Book listing never reflected this change. It remained Bath Road for the next 6 years. Were the listings simply repeated year to year? Or did the owners have to send in an update, in which case, why didn't Burney provide the new information. So I think there is that issue. Related to that, though, is this question of privacy, right? So on the one hand, we have an address that doesn't match. We also have an owner that we cannot find. And I think that this speaks to what is really still considerable racial violence, even in Rhode Island, the potential for racial violence. So imagine that you can come up to this door at 35 Bath Road, which is really 35 Memorial Boulevard, and ask for Mrs. L. Jackson. There is a moment there where Bernie and her partners can say, no, I'm sorry, you have the wrong address. Or there is a moment to say, yes, come on in. And I think that that was part of the important defensive measure of maintaining a house, even in Newport during this period. All right. So this is, we're going to still in Newport at 82 William Street. This is the Ma Gruber tourist home. It was not actually owned by Ma Gruber, right? Sort of a name that implies a nice down-home experience, Ma Gruber. In fact, it was owned by Reese M. Magruder, an African-American man born in 1878 in Georgia. I imagine him very large. And so I get this gives me a giggle that he was believed to be Ma Gruber. Magruder owned the property at 82 William Street. At the time, he was a widower with no employment. Magruber was listed in the 1954 volume of the Green Book only. And that in and of itself is especially curious. How it came to be Ma Gruber versus Magruder is probably a mishearing or information passed by the telephone. But even more curious is that in 1954, Magruder no longer lived there, and he hadn't lived there for two years. He left in 1952. And instead, the house is occupied by other people. So again, questions remain. Did Magruder, had he offered his house to tourists in the past, and that is how it got back to Victor Green? Was there a word of mouth? So-and-so told so-and-so something about it. Either way, I think these are the curiosities. And when we talk about user-driven content that goes into the Green Book, these are some of the challenges we see when we really look at it. All right, so moving up to Providence. This is the Marie Wells Beauty Parlor at 18 Benefit Street, also listed in the Green Book only for 1 year, 1947. Now, according to the city directory, the official name of the business was the Marinella Beauty Shop, and its owner was Mary Young, who lived upstairs with her husband Raymond, who was a window washer. So again, there is no Marie Wells living anywhere in the vicinity. And again, it seems likely that Marie Wells was a misinterpretation or a mishearing of Marinella. This property speaks to a different issue pursuant to Green Book history. It survives as part of Antoinette Downing's efforts to preserve Benefit Street in Providence. At the time, according to Downing, the area was a slum, afflicted by overcrowding and poor conditions. Galvanized by the Rhode Island School of Design's plan to demolish large portions of Benefit Street to build new dormitories, Downing joined with John Nicholas Brown to found the Providence Preservation Society. In 1960, the College Hill Historic District was created and gentrification ensued. This was the first historic district in Rhode Island. So on Benefit Street, gentrification meant that the street's poorer and African-American residents would be pushed out. And Downing, to her small credit, did report later that she did regret that this happened. It is more than possible that the Marie Wells Beauty Parlor was evicted as part of this preservation. So while the building survives and it has been preserved and it is protected, it is not protected for this history. And I often call this inadvertent preservation. We have this building because of Antoinette, and that's great, but she didn't save it because it was a Green Book site. All right. So a couple more sites. This is B. Boyd's Beauty Parlor at 43 Camp Street. This was owned and operated by African-American women. This is not uncommon in the Green Book listings. B. Boyd is actually Beulah Boyd Jackson, as you can see on her, here she is on the Hopkins map. And she and her husband Raymond owned the property at 43 Camp Street. They were also Great Migration transplants. Raymond came from Maryland and Beulah from Virginia. And in 1940, the first year that they listed in the Green Book, they had a 6-year-old son, Raymond Jr., and a 1-month-old daughter, Addie Mae. They also shared their house with Raymond's widowed aunt, Jenny Walters. And there were several other households associated. I think it was a largish house. So other parts of the property or the house were rented to Clarence and Eleanor Jackson. another to Josephine Edmonds and her 12-year-old son, Stanley. And it's possible that they are all one large family group, but it is hard to tell. Now, here's what's fun about Beulah's. Beulah's beauty parlor business was in operation as early as 1935. And Raymond, who worked alternately as a machinist, was also a hairdresser in the operation, and he moved back and forth between the two jobs as was most lucrative. Eleanor also worked in the salon, and after 1947, Beulah and Eleanor were joined by Margaret Mayo, who also moved into the residence, so this is really kind of a crowded place. This house was demolished to build a new elementary school and middle school complex. So the Green Book listing itself is the only thing that survives. So here's the quick return to the Biltmore, which is Providence's major hotel. And it is something that is, I think, not ever told about this hotel, is that it was open occupancy. Between 1947 and 1955, African Americans were welcomed there and could avail themselves of the hotel's many services, which included a drugstore, printer, postal telegraph office, a barbershop, gift shop, cigar stand, stenographer, because you never knew when you need a stenographer, clothing stores, and there were 6 different restaurants. So it would have been a key destination. The Biltmore was designed by Warren and Wetmore and constructed in 1922. It was the first major hotel constructed in Providence. The hotel was legendary during Prohibition, mainly because Rhode Island was, shockingly, so lax in enforcing its anti-drinking laws. And the hotel quickly became a big band era hotspot, hosting the likes of Benny Goodman and Jimmy Dorsey. As time passed, the Biltmore kept up with the times, hosting John and Jackie Kennedy, Audrey Hepburn, and Rocky Marciano, among others. Danny DeVito and Rhea Perlman have graced its doors, and at one point, one of might have even seen a handsome young senator by the name of Joe Biden. The hotel was particularly famous for the Bacante girls, scantily clad waitresses who served the banquets in the Bacante room. The Bacante girls were summoned to the table by a button. In the process, they had to pass through the bar, and pink lighting streamed up through the bar's glass floors, lighting their diaphanous skirts and showing off their legs. I can't resist telling that story. So there's a lot more work to be done on the Biltmore. I think we're really only beginning to scratch the surface of the Biltmore, its relationship with its African-American clients. But I want to turn quickly to the last site that I want to look at in Rhode Island, which is George's Service Station, run by George H. Walter, a specialist in tire repair. And I can't tell you how excited I was to go out in the field and find this still standing. It is the only automotive service store listed in the Green Book in Rhode Island for the publication's entire run. It was located in a very different part of town than all the other Green Book sites. It's really off by itself, as well as other automotive services. It's really not in that part of town either. That part of town was under the Providence Place Mall. So its existence is documented only on the 1937 Atlas map, which you're looking at, and then lastly in the building itself survives in obviously very adapted form. Route 6 is a little bit in the distance there, and there was an exit ramp. I'm standing with my back to the exit ramp. So, I mean, it came this close, really, to the end. So that this building survives is really, I think, a miracle. And again, just to point out, this is not something that people coming to Rhode Island look at. All right, so I wanted to, when I was asked to give this talk, I said to them, I'd be happy to talk about Rhode Island, but I know people who do things on the Green Book in Massachusetts. Maybe you would like to have them instead. And they said, no, they wanted me. So if I have bored you about Rhode Island, let me assure you that that was the intent. And turn my attention ever so quickly to Massachusetts to tell you the little that I do know about the Green Book in Massachusetts. So to begin with, African Americans have been residents in Massachusetts since at least 1638, when a ship named Desiree landed in Boston with the first African slaves. This event occurred a mere 18 years after the landing of the Pilgrims at Plymouth, and 8 years after the founding of Boston. So lest you think that there were not enslaved people in the North very early, there were. From the 17th to the 19th centuries, a small community of free African Americans resided at the base of Copp's Hill in Boston's North End, now today a cemetery. And in 1790, 4 men who had been slaves gained their freedom by fighting for the American Revolution, formed a community of African Americans in Plymouth. That is the Parting Ways community. By the Civil War, African American communities were spread across Massachusetts, and by the mid-20th century, millions of African Americans had migrated from the South to live in these communities. The 1938 Green Book, just that issue, was the first to include Massachusetts, and it had only 2 listings, the Harriet Tubman House and the Melbourne Hotel. By 1939, however, the listings spanned the entire state and included tourist homes in Springfield, Pittsfield, North Adams, and Great Barrington in western Massachusetts, hotels, tourist homes, and restaurants in Boston, and tourist houses in Plymouth and on Cape Cod. Springfield and Boston were along major highways, but Pittsfield, North Adams, Great Barrington, and Plymouth were areas frequented by tourists, including African American tourists. Between 1939 and 1964, listings were added and removed for tourist homes, restaurants, resorts, and various services in 43 cities and towns across the Commonwealth. Numerous Boston area sites were demolished during the urban renewal period of the 1960s. However, many remain in the South End and Lower Roxbury neighborhoods, which remain predominantly African American. Verification of the existence of sites along Cape Cod and on Martha's Vineyard is more difficult. Thank you for doing the work, Fallon. Because many of the addresses in the Green Book are simply P.O. boxes, so it really takes an extra layer to unravel the P.O. box location. Overall, about 53% of Massachusetts Green Book listings are known to have survived, making Massachusetts a leader in preserving these important sites. Now, this is Nantucket's sole Green Book listing. It was the Skipper Restaurant, located on a former cargo schooner, and I have to say that this is the only Green Book listing that I know of that occupied a ship. The Skipper Restaurant began as a tea room that was opened in 1920 by Margaret Prentice and Gladys Wood. A year later, needing a larger venue, they purchased the Allen Gurney, a 92-foot-long two-masted schooner that had been built in 1867 and leaked. Stationing the ship on Steamship Wharf, Prentice and Wood leased a building formerly occupied by the Enquirer and Mirror, which I am assuming you guys will have to tell me that went somewhere else, and then combined the 2 spaces into a restaurant. I am told that the specialty was the Shore Dinner Deluxe, a lobster dish that cost $2.15. Those were the days. Prentice and Wood owned the Skipper until 1944 when they sold it to new owners who in 1962 listed it in the Green Book. It was demolished in 1984. All right, so what is the takeaway? Well, first and foremost, the Green Book is a story of survival and of how to live amid laws that authorize and legitimize discrimination. The Green Book enabled African Americans to get around the major challenges that governed their lives, some of them anyway. With such a travel guide in hand, African Americans could visit family wherever they lived or begin the process of starting anew in a strange city. Secondly, the Green Book was about African Americans supporting their own community. The book promoted Black businesses and the Black community, giving newcomers a way in and offering protection to newcomers traveling through unfamiliar territory. And it reveals this community, lost on those who refused to see it. The Green Book and the other African American travel guides testify to this community that is long gone, although still remembered. And I think this raises a really critical point. The only way to know a site is listed in the Green Book is to look in the Green Book. That is the only way you know. All right, so thirdly, the Green Book is about movement through landscape, and something that I'd argue is key to the experience of being human. That African American movement was restricted, dates from the slavery era, it is important to view the Jim Crow limitations in that context, in the context of slavery, because they do derive from our slave past. But the Green Book enabled movement, and thereby a certain level of African American liberation. So you should not see this as in a negative context. This is what they had to do to survive. You should see this as a source of empowerment, right? This is overcoming. This is liberation captured in a little book about 6 inches large and easily stashed in the glove box of your average automobile. Thank you very much. So all of the information that I've compiled or told you about today is getting compiled into a database that is hosted by the University of Virginia's Institute for Advanced Technology and the Humanities. This is the website for it. My own website's below. And I had asked in case, yes, okay, thank you. So it went in the chat for the Zoom for the people online. This is what started me on this process. Was learning about the history of the Green Book sites and eventually compiling them into something much, much larger. So I hope you'll stay tuned for this. Right now we have Rhode Island, Virginia, and Maryland, but we've been working all through the pandemic with scholars in the field to get more of the information into the database. And so stay tuned, because I think it's coming, and I think it's going to be awesome. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. I will just say I got a text from my friend Claire, who's watching from the Preservation Society of Newport County, and she said that was fascinating, and I agree.
Well, Claire, I'd be happy to come and speak to the PS. Usually they don't want me for this. That's okay. So.
I was curious. I saw, and I could be mistaken because I'm in the back, but under the Providence listing for the Green Books, I saw one place called Dixieland Tavern. I thought that was really ironic to have in the Green Book this name with Dixieland. I thought it was ironic that it would be in Rhode Island in general. So I didn't know if you knew any more of that part of the story.
Yeah, so I don't know why it's called the Dixieland Tavern. Rhode Island, it turned out to, I have circled around this aspect of Rhode Island's history for quite some time. And so one thing that strikes me about Rhode Island is how important it was as a destination for people as part of the Great Migration. If I had to guess, and I'm still getting to Dixieland, so again, stay tuned in the database, that is another owner who came from the South and who named it that, possibly to appeal to other travelers coming through. Dixieland Tavern is in Providence, so it would have hit people coming through New York, from New York up into Boston. And again, it could have just appealed and attracted to this Great Migration audience. You don't think of Rhode Island as a destination for the Great Migration. You think of Chicago or Detroit. I mean, we don't have a huge number of jobs, but indeed it was. So yeah. Is it tongue-in-cheek? Maybe. Yeah.
Thanks, Catherine, for your presentation. I've been fascinated by the idea that you don't know about these sites until you find the Green Book. So I wanted to just let the students know they've all been digitized. They're on the New York Public Library's website. I'm curious about the database that you and the other scholars are putting together, because I'm absolutely just intrigued by the story of Baltimore and the urban renewal that has happened there, and the fact that without Sanborn maps and Green Book and census records, we may not know of those resources that were once intact. We're finding a lot of that same history in Florida, in Jacksonville, in particular, the Chitlin Circuit of African-American musicians there. So with this database and the research for the other states, are there mappings of these sorts of urban renewal projects that have decimated these sites?
So to give you a good story about how, for your students, how this issue of the only way to know it's a Green Book site is to look in the Green Book. Back in my salad days, I too had students, and I spent a whole semester, the class was archival research, and we partnered with the Newport Restoration Foundation, and everybody got a house. And the idea was to research the history of the house, putting them through the paces of this is what a census is, this is how you look at it, this is what deeds are, here's how you look at them. So I spent a whole semester on 42 Division Street with a phenomenal student who went on to do, I mean, if she is, her goal is art theft, she will get there. That kind of student. She was amazing. And a year went by, and we're researching, again, the semester's over, and I've been in the weeds as much as Cayman had been on this house, 42 Division Street. And a year goes by, and I'm working on the Green Book, and I'm thinking to myself, 42 Division Street, this is really familiar, 42 Division Street, why is this so familiar? And it finally clicked to me that, of course, I had spent a semester researching with Cayman 42 Division Street, and not once had we come across its history as a Green Book site. We knew it had been owned by African Americans. We knew that Doris Duke had bought, again, 42 Division Street. It's another Newport Restoration Foundation house, but it did not, there was no other way to know except by looking in the Green Book. And that was really startling to me, the ephemerality of this layer of history and how quickly it could be gone and how easy it was to be overlooked. Who would think? Why would you think, out of all the houses in Newport, and out of the Newport Restoration owns some 80 houses, why you would even think to look in the Green Book? it just, was really, I mean, I had to sit down for a couple of minutes because it was so sort of sad and terrifying that this all layer, I mean, it just, wow, poof, right? So that was part of what reinvigorated. I've been working on this database and the project behind it for going on 5 years now, and it's things like that that kind of keep me, hopping along there because it is very daunting. The database, so we started small. It all starts small, right? We started with posters to the Southeast chapter of the Society of Architectural Historians. Myself, my friend Ann Bruder, who studies Maryland, my friend Susan Hellman, who studies Virginia, a lovely woman named Susan Allen, who did Mississippi, and then a group of students who had already been working in North Carolina under Alicia McGill at NC State. Those were 5 posters we put together on the Green Book sites in those states, and we took them to the conference, and the next thing that happened was I walked away with people in Arkansas and Massachusetts and South Carolina, and I can't even remember. So the next conference, instead of 5 posters, I had 11. And the next conference, I had 15. And I have, posters hanging around my, my house looking for these opportunities. And right away, people kept saying, you have to build a database. Well, yes, we have to build a database. But it was not that easy. I mean, people are like, put it online. The data moves in so many different directions. The comparison from state to state really made that clear. That what's happening in Rhode Island is very different from what's happening in Mississippi. It's very different from what's happening in Arkansas. And then how the scholars tackle this, because it's all free labor, how the scholars tackle this is also very different. So in Tennessee, I had a phenomenal group of 4 scholars distributed all across. So I had somebody in Memphis, somebody in Nashville, somebody in Knoxville, somebody in Chattanooga. And that was great because that covered Tennessee all the way across. At the same time, I had Arkansas, that was 1 guy in the SHPO's office in Arkansas. Massachusetts, 2 people who work for consultants. So everybody's time and what they were able to do was different. And the database needed to be able to flex in every possible direction it could flex in order to really represent what was going on in the ground and then the reality of how this was being researched. So it was not this. And then came the challenge of how our 3 independent, totally impoverished, not a 501c3 scholar is going to pull this off. And we asked around a lot. We talked to a lot of people, and we finally landed at IAF at UVA just really because they were willing to put a lot of programming in hours in behind the scenes, and they have, in order to support us. We went to them because we are all alumni of the program, but it was really a fortuitous thing. So to get to your actual question, blather, about the mapping. So yes, we hope so. Baltimore is an excellent example where what we hope we can do is lay a historic map that shows the original street pattern over the existing Google map, and then you can see where they will fall on that. We're not there yet. Right now, we're really just trying to populate the database. And then in order to do the mapping function itself, we still need GPS coordinates. So finding GPS coordinates of what is no longer there has its challenges. And then equally challenging is finding the people who have the time and the headspace to do it. We have, some really wonderful models of partnership. Others just, fall apart for various reasons. People get busy, and again, everybody is doing this on their own time, and it's hard to ask for more, honestly, because they're giving us so much already. So that's key. It was an incredibly long-winded answer. I'm really sorry.
I have a question about maybe another magical connection who you maybe know or don't know. Do you know the artist Jonathan Kalm?
Help me out.
So maybe not. So he's an African-American artist. He's one of our colleagues from Columbia who has been working on a 5-year project mapping Green Book locations.
Yes. So there are lots of people that are mapping. And so on our webpage, you will see where we're getting to is an aggregator of other projects associated with the Green Book.
Oh, very interesting.
There are lots of people doing lots of really interesting things with Green Book. And the twists on it are always really fascinating. So it is super easy to and I've seen a lot of projects that do this, take an issue of the Green Book, load up the addresses, lay them all out on Google, and voila, you're done. Except, right? Not always the right addresses. The addresses don't always exist anymore. What do you do with a P.O. box, right? So we've seen a lot of that just sort of overlap it. And our hope is that we have somebody actually looking in the field. That's another thing where I often we get, oh, it's a Green Book site. No, that was built in 1980. It's not a Green Book site. Maybe on the site, maybe on the footprint of an existing, pre-existing Green Book site, but it is this, what you're looking at is not. So yeah. So what sets us apart is that we are looking specifically at that and trying to be as accurate as possible. And then we are architectural historians, so we are interested in what has happened to the building, or in other words, the physical fabric of it. The stories are wonderful, and it's my favorite part of the Green Book. But what we really are hoping to do is generate the information that is needed to do some of the preservation mechanics behind this that can help get these buildings preserved. So many things are batted around. One is a marker system. That's an idea. The National Park Service has come forth wanting to do Green Book sites located along Route 66. That's great. Does anybody know where they are and which ones they are? And I mean, this is part of what our project we hope will be able to identify and foster. This is, I think, a terrific and very timely moment to do, say, each state could do an addendum to their whatever their existing documentation is, or write something new. It is possible to create a district that is a non-contiguous district, so you could do that. But in order to do that, you have to have the inventory, right? You have to know what the sites are and where they're located. And so, again, this is part of what this project is intended to enable. It's also a project that can allow, we've danced around this topic a little bit today. What do you do with a property that is really just not architecturally significant, that you're putting on a national register for reasons other than the beauty of its architecture, like the Glover House, the Glover Hotel, right? Not a work of art, not a thing of beauty, never was. How do you get that protected and listed? And creating a cultural context is one way to do that. Again, a long-winded answer, sorry.
I have, of course, too many questions and comments, but I will restrict them to two, which is, one is that given the interest also in the kind of the built environment of these spaces that were to be protective spaces for people traveling, is there plans to actually accumulate architectural documentation that corresponds with these sites to do, you mentioned at the beginning, kind of similarities between the kinds of sites in each location, whether it's Newport or Providence. Would there be, I wonder about the possibilities of being able to understand whether there were similar types of spaces that were listed, not just similar types of businesses that were listed, and that whether that had any. Obviously, it's contingent on people being able to own and occupy these spaces, but whether that has any bearing on whether people felt that they could accommodate people traveling is one question I have. Mm-hmm. As a kind of long-term something that might be part of this project. Yeah. And the second is just around. I was really fascinated by this whole matter of racial violence against those who owned or operated these properties. And have you found any kind of newspaper reporting or anything that suggests that something like that has actually happened?
No, and I'm amazed to have not found that. And none of the scholars that I've worked with have reported that either, because again, and perhaps this is my 21st century lens, but I don't think it's that far off. Were you wanting to do harm to people in the Green Book, wouldn't you start at the top with your shotgun and work your way through the list? There it is, right there in print. Grab yourself a Green Book, it's at the Esso station, right, for $1. So that it didn't happen, I think, is really interesting.
And that some places have, some states and cities have more P.O. boxes than others.
Yes.
And, whether that's a sign of whether people felt safe enough or not safe enough to do so.
Yeah, I think the Jackson House, the L. Jackson House on Bath Road, Memorial Boulevard, I think it speaks to that. This was the researching the individual sites, which again, I am fortunate to do because I have so few of them, has really poked some holes in the understanding of the Green Book as I think the narrative is being told. So the question of how did you get listed? Well, I have plenty of cases where the information is just flat out not correct. It's just wrong. And what happened when you have wrong information? If you're the traveler, what does that mean? How do you get past that? Another good example is where the rubber hits the road on these listings is, for example, in Newport, they are all accommodations. There's nothing else listed. Those all 8 sites, it's 7 tourist homes and a hotel. So where do you get your gas? How does that work? And I'd argue even Providence is pretty slim as far as variety of listings. There are very few of them, but places like Virginia have campgrounds and, bowling alleys. I mean, and Rhode Island has none of that. So again, the reality of how did it work, if you're rolling into Newport and you're looking for a service station, how do you find that? Do you go to, say, a tourist home and ask? Right, Newport's not very big, that's very doable. About the Bath Road site, that's in a really different part of town than the rest of them. It is about as, it is the closest to Bellevue Avenue. So if one were to think about needing the extra layer of that moment of deniability as somebody, you have an opportunity there to size them up at the front door there, right? They're here looking for L. Jackson at 35 Bath Road. You are Sophie Burney at 35 Memorial Boulevard. You have a moment there where you can say, I'm sorry, you have the wrong address, right? So if the guy's standing there with a shotgun, this is your moment to say, I'm sorry, you got the wrong place, right? Or it's a moment to size them up and say, oh, no, you come on in, you need help. And I don't necessarily mean that entirely in a are they black or white context, although I'm sure that was a big part of standing there in the doorway in that moment. I think there were other cues that would have said, not here, or come on in. So I think a lot about those sorts of questions because, again, it's such a different sort of a place. I've researched Newport for the last 20 years. These are some of the cracks that I look in and see different things based on where they are in Newport. This has been a real joy to climb around a part of Newport I've never climbed around before. So, and I lost track of your first question.
I mean, you somewhat didn't answer, but I'm just saying the bathhouse, it's in a different part of town. It's a large structure. And I was just curious as to kind of whether there was any consistency in architecture amongst the sites that were listed.
Yeah.
And so you did say that most of them were, tourist homes.
Yeah.
And which I would presume to be larger. So as opposed to just like the individual, African-American homeowner in Providence who's, willing to accept boarders and people traveling, those aren't the types of houses on the list.
So again, I can only speak to what's happening in Rhode Island, but there are the question of the larger kind of architectural trends. In Rhode Island, what you see are what would be mid to late 19th century houses that are being repurposed and into this idea for African American travel and safety. So again, I'm thinking they're all going to be the little 19th century cottage and gable roof with the porch and the gingerbread, and there you go. So there are 3 of them right there. That's a very common form in Rhode Island, and this is what Antoinette Downing was preserving when she put the Benefit Street Historic District through. This was what she was preserving. So again, in Rhode Island, I don't know if it'll be a common type elsewhere. We'll have to find out.
So it's like those types, not like boarding houses.
Oh, yeah.
Other style structures that are also of large scale.
Yeah, I think, again, outside of Rhode Island, the sites get a lot more diverse. And as we find that information out, that's something to keep an eye on. Again, because we are dependent on the kindness of strangers, but they're not strangers. We love them, and we get to know them very well over this project. What they collect is, the type of information that they collect is really about what they see as important in their own state. And it's kind of funny, we have a place in the database for an architectural description, and not one of the people working in the project, including the three founders, myself, Ann, and Susan, have written one. and we had a good laugh about it. And I said, I don't know, I don't think I will. And Ann said she was really chomping to get to it, and Susan was like, eh. So I don't know, but we have a space for it in the database.
Very cool.
So, yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you very much. That was really wonderful. And so
We need a-
everyone,
we
one
need a-
more time.
We need a break?